channel. This is the Multipolar Dispatch channel. Today's episode will be narrated by George. Thank you.
Hello. Welcome back to the Multipolar Dispatch channel. This is episode 3. In the last episode, we traced the strategic blueprint behind the Ukraine conflict from Mackinder in 1904 to Brzezinski in 1997 to the Pentagon's own published strategy documents today. We also heard former Western leaders openly acknowledge that the Minsk peace process was used to buy time for Ukraine's military buildup. Today, we go deeper into the documented evidence of what was actually done inside Ukraine over more than 70 years by American and British intelligence operations. Not rumors, not anonymous internet speculation, but declassified files, named officials, leaked documents, and public admissions, in their own words. One of the most important things to understand about this subject is that the CIA's long involvement inside Ukraine is not disputed. It is not conspiracy theory, it is documented fact. The evidence exists inside the CIA's own declassified files, available through the CIA reading room on cia.gov, thousands of pages, spanning decades. One of the most important operations was called Project AERODYNAMIC. The operation formally began in 1949, and its objective was explicit. Now I want to read carefully from one of the CIA's own declassified files, dated July 13, 1953, and I quote directly, "The purpose of Project AERODYNAMIC is to provide for the exploitation and expansion of the anti-Soviet Ukrainian resistance. Pause for Cold War and hot war purposes." End quote. And the document continues by specifically identifying Ukrainian nationalist organizations that would be utilized, including networks linked to Stepan Bandera. Again, this is not interpretation. I'm quoting directly from the CIA's own declassified file, available publicly at cia.gov. A second CIA document from 1958 states, quote, "The main rationale of our support was to have a foothold in the whole subject of Ukrainian nationalism, with ultimate targeting, of course, at the Ukrainian SSR," end quote. Again, the CIA's words, not mine. A third document from 1967 states, quote, "It is considered opportune and important to continue to encourage these divisive manifestations in the Ukrainian SSR," end quote. Now step back for a moment. What do these documents show? They show that for decades, American intelligence agencies viewed Ukrainian nationalism as a strategic instrument inside the broader Cold War confrontation with Moscow. The scale alone is remarkable. More than 3,800 documents, over 4 decades of operations. From 1949 until the collapse of the Soviet Union, and one particularly sensitive dimension involved the network surrounding Stepan Bandera, a deeply controversial World War II figure whose followers collaborated with Nazi Germany and participated in atrocities against Jews and Poles. Yet, from the perspective of Cold War intelligence logic, these networks were seen as useful anti-Soviet assets. The moral ambiguity was simply absorbed into the strategic calculus, and importantly, these operations did not simply disappear after the Cold War ended. They evolved, and this was not solely an American operation. British intelligence was deeply involved from the beginning as well. Historian Stephen Dorrell documented that in 1949, the same year Project AERODYNAMIC began, MI6 was already inserting anti-Soviet Ukrainian nationalist agents into Soviet territory using unmarked RAF aircraft. British intelligence, American intelligence, shared networks, shared objectives. And over time, the operation evolved beyond covert Cold War activity into something much more ambitious, the gradual reconstruction of Ukrainian national identity itself. Now, this is an extremely sensitive subject. So, let us stay disciplined and factual. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Western funding increasingly flowed into Ukrainian media organizations, civil society groups, academic institutions, youth programs, and political networks. Victoria Nuland herself publicly stated that the United States had invested roughly $5 billion in Ukrainian, quote, democratic development, end quote, since 1991. Again, those are her words, publicly stated, not leaked, not hidden. And after 2014, the cultural transformation accelerated significantly. school curricula changed. Figures like Stepan Bandera were increasingly rehabilitated as nationalist heroes, streets renamed, statues erected. Meanwhile, Russian language use became progressively restricted in public institutions, despite Russian remaining the daily language of millions of Ukrainians. And then came one of the most extraordinary moments in modern diplomacy: the leaked Victoria Nuland phone call. Its authenticity was never seriously disputed. In the call, Nuland discusses which Ukrainian politician should lead the post-Maidan government. Her phrase was, "Yats is our guy." 3 weeks later, the Ukrainian government changed, and the preferred candidate discussed in the call became Prime Minister. Now, whether one views Maidan as revolution, coup, or something in between, the level of direct Western involvement becomes difficult to deny, and the intelligence relationship deepened further after 2014. Reports emerged describing what was called a three-way partnership between Ukrainian intelligence, the CIA, and MI6. Training programs expanded, intelligence integration deepened, CIA facilities reportedly multiplied inside Ukraine, and by 2024, even the head of MI6 publicly acknowledged ongoing covert activity. Sir Richard Moore stated, quote, "We cherish our heritage of covert action, pause, which we keep alive today in helping Ukraine resist the Russian invasion." End quote. Again, that is not speculation. That is the head of MI6 speaking publicly. Leaked Pentagon documents later also revealed the presence of British special forces operating inside Ukraine, despite Britain not officially being at war with Russia. Now here, we reach perhaps the deepest and most uncomfortable part of the entire discussion. Ukraine and Russia historically shared extraordinary civilizational overlap, shared Orthodox Christianity, closely related languages, shared historical origins in the Kievan Rus. For centuries, many people moved fluidly between Russian and Ukrainian identity, and yet over decades, through education systems, media narratives, political restructuring, historical revision, and information shaping, a new national consciousness emerged, one increasingly defined not merely as separate from Russia, but in opposition to Russia. And whatever one's politics, the scale of that transformation is historically remarkable. Because perhaps the most powerful weapon modern intelligence systems possess is not military hardware. It is the ability, over long periods of time, to shape identity itself. Now we arrive at the most important question: has the strategy actually worked? And here, honesty becomes essential, because much Western media coverage still frames the conflict almost entirely through the lens of Russian failure. But the actual strategic picture is far more complicated. Russia has unquestionably suffered major costs, large casualties, economic disruption, international isolation across much of the Western alliance. And Ukraine's military has fought with extraordinary resilience. All of that is true. But several core strategic assumptions in Washington also failed. The sanctions regime, described as the most comprehensive in modern history, did not collapse the Russian state. Russian energy exports were redirected through countries such as India, China, and Turkey. The ruble initially crashed, then stabilized. Russian military production accelerated, and in some areas, Russian artillery production reportedly surpassed the combined output of NATO countries. The second major failure involved global isolation. Much of the global south refused to fully align with Western sanctions policy. India continued purchasing Russian energy. China deepened economic cooperation with Moscow. Many African, Asian, and Latin American states declined to adopt the Western framing of the war entirely. And perhaps most importantly of all, the strategy produced the opposite outcome from the one originally intended. Instead of separating Russia from China, the pressure campaign drove them closer together. Every sanction, every frozen asset, every financial restriction, every diplomatic escalation accelerated the very Eurasian alignment that American strategists had hoped to prevent. And then there is the human cost. The Ukrainian people themselves, millions displaced, large casualty numbers, demographic collapse, destroyed infrastructure, a generation traumatized by war. Whatever strategic game was being played, ordinary Ukrainians paid the highest price, and this leaves us with a deeply uncomfortable conclusion. The bear was wounded, but not drowned. The first major stage of the strategic sequence remains incomplete. And the longer it remains incomplete, the more unstable the wider geopolitical environment becomes. And in closing, over the last 2 episodes, we have examined 2 connected questions. First, the strategic blueprint, a geopolitical framework stretching from Mackinder in 1904 through Brzezinski to the Pentagon's modern strategy documents. And second, the operational history, decades of documented intelligence involvement inside Ukraine, drawn not from speculation but from declassified files, public admissions and named sources. You may agree with this interpretation, you may reject parts of it, but the underlying documents exist, the admissions exist, and they deserve to be examined seriously. Because Ukraine was never the final destination. It was one square on a much larger geopolitical chessboard. And understanding the pattern may become increasingly important as the next phases of global confrontation continue to unfold. This is the Multipolar Dispatch, and we'll see you next week.